So you wanted to listen to my first travel experiment. All right, settle down, and let me take you back 2,000 years. I did not travel back in time because I believed I could improve it. That belief belongs to people who think history bends easily, who imagine causality as something tractable, responsive to intervention like clay under skilled hands. They speak of butterfly effects and cascading changes, of grandfather paradoxes and branching timelines, as though time were a mechanism that could be understood by metaphor. I went back because I wanted to remove a single certainty and watch what replaced it. I wanted to see what happened when a story lost its ending, not its beginning, not its middle, but the precise moment that gave all other moments their meaning in retrospect. Every narrative requires closure to become fixed. Without it, events remain unprocessed, interpretable, dangerously open to revision. The moment I chose was not dramatic to the people living inside it. Executions in Roman Judea were not spectacles of destiny, not theaters of cosmic significance. They were maintenance, administrative solutions to persistent problems. The machinery of empire applied locally, efficiently, without ceremony beyond what intimidation required. Jerusalem in that particular spring was full, restless in the ordinary way cities become restless when authority watches too closely, and crowds grow dense with bodies that have traveled far for rituals they only half remember. Pilgrims moved through narrow streets with the specific exhaustion of the faithful, tired but determined, irritable but purposeful. Roman soldiers were alert but bored, standing in formations that suggested vigilance, while their eyes tracked nothing in particular. They had learned to recognize the difference between disturbance and mere noise. Local leaders were cautious, not cruel. They navigated between populations and governors, between tradition and practicality, making calculations that kept communities intact even when they could not keep them happy. Jesus of Nazareth had already been arrested. That mattered. Once a man crossed that threshold, once he passed from the street into custody, Rome rarely reconsidered him. Not because Rome was inflexible, it was in fact remarkably adaptable when adaptation served it, but because reconsideration suggested uncertainty, and uncertainty was what empire could least afford to project. But Rome was not a machine of perfect precision. It was a machine of paperwork, delays, reassignment, and indifference. Orders moved through channels. Officials answered to other officials who answered to others still. Soldiers were transferred, rotated, promoted, demoted. Priorities shifted. Attention wandered. So the change was small. A transfer delayed by a day because a courier caught fever on the road from Caesarea. An order questioned by a junior officer who'd been taught to verify documentation and who noticed that signatures did not match the registry he had been given 3 months prior. A prisoner moved sideways instead of forward, reassigned to a different holding area, while jurisdictional questions were resolved through correspondence that traveled slowly because spring rains had made certain roads impassable. By the time anyone noticed the inconsistency, urgency had faded. There were always other disturbances, always another crowd forming somewhere, another preacher speaking too loudly in the market, another dispute between factions that threatened to become something worse. Attention moved efficiently toward whatever seemed most immediate. No announcement was made. Rome did not explain itself to the governed. its authority derived partly from never appearing to require justification. To announce that an execution had been delayed would be to suggest that explanation was owed, and that suggestion would undermine the very authority that made executions effective as deterrents. The execution simply did not occur, not on the day expected, not the day after, not the week after. Those waiting for closure waited longer than expected, then longer still. Some assumed the execution would happen later, that this was merely Roman inefficiency expressing itself in familiar ways. Others interpreted delay as deliberate strategy. Perhaps Pilate was waiting for the festival crowds to disperse. Perhaps he wanted to avoid martyrdom narratives that could form around a public death during sacred days. Some left Jerusalem, returning to villages and lives that required their presence more urgently than grief did. Some argued among themselves about what delay meant, whether it indicated divine intervention or political calculation or simple bureaucratic confusion. Eventually, the ritual dissolved into rumor. Stories circulated. He had been executed quietly. He had been released. He had escaped. He had been transferred to Caesarea. He had died in custody before the execution could proceed. He was still imprisoned, forgotten, in some cell where paperwork had ceased to follow him. Among Jesus' followers, confusion came before belief. They had prepared for death. They had rehearsed their responses to catastrophe. They knew how to mourn, how to gather afterward, how to speak about what had been lost. The shape of their grief had already been determined by expectation. They had not prepared for ambiguity. Some whispered that God had intervened, that the same power that had parted seas and toppled walls had reached into Roman custody and extracted their teacher from a fate that had seemed inevitable. This interpretation offered comfort but created questions. If God had intervened, why not earlier? Why allow arrest at all? Why permit suffering up to a point and then halt it arbitrarily? Others suspected bribery or political calculation. Perhaps followers with resources had negotiated quietly. Perhaps influential sympathizers had spoken to the right officials. Perhaps Pilate had reconsidered the political wisdom of making a martyr during a season when martyrdom would be most visible. Many said nothing at all, because silence felt safer than interpretation. To speak was to commit to a narrative that might be contradicted by the next piece of information. Better to wait, to see what became clear, to allow events to resolve themselves into a story that could be told without immediate challenge. Jesus did not return to Jerusalem. He could not. A man who had entered the machinery of Roman justice, even incompletely, remained visible to it. His name appeared in reports. Officials knew his face. Visibility was danger, and danger did not dissipate simply because immediate consequences had been postponed. So he withdrew, moving east initially, toward regions where Roman presence thinned and local governance predominated. Then north, into territories where communities were smaller, more isolated, less likely to include informants or officials. With long memories, he was carried by people who believed in him enough to hide him, but not enough to understand fully what his survival meant. Some saw it as miracle, others as luck, some as strategic withdrawal. The interpretations multiplied because no single interpretation could contain what had occurred, or rather, what had failed to occur. Teaching continued, but it changed shape. He spoke to few and those few varied. Sometimes they were people who had followed him before, who had traveled to hear him, and who now traveled further to hear him again. Sometimes they were new audiences, communities that knew him only through reputation, who listened without the weight of prior expectation. The teachings themselves had not changed. The parables remained recognizable. The ethical emphasis, the focus on compassion and justice, and the coming kingdom, all of this persisted. But the context had changed, and context alters meaning, even when words remain identical. Before, he had spoken with the urgency of someone who anticipated confrontation. His words had carried the intensity of a message that needed to be delivered completely because time might be short. Now, he spoke with a different rhythm, not urgency, but persistence, not intensity, but patience. Those who listened heard the same words but absorbed them differently. Already, something important had shifted. Words no longer traveled with their speaker. When he had moved through Galilee previously, teaching in synagogues and on hillsides, the message and the messenger were inseparable. People came to hear him specifically, to watch how he moved and spoke, to measure his presence against the stories they had heard. Now, separated from Jerusalem, moving through unfamiliar territory, his words reached people before he did. Stories traveled faster than feet. Accounts of teachings circulated through networks of trade and kinship, carried by travelers who had heard him or heard someone who had heard him. And when words travel alone, they adapt. They simplify or elaborate depending on who carries them. They attach themselves to local concerns. They merge with existing traditions or separate from them depending on the audience. For roughly one generation, coherence held. Those who had seen him, who had heard him directly, remained alive and active. They corrected exaggeration when it became too extreme. They pushed back against interpretations that strayed too far from what they remembered. They argued about emphasis, about which teachings mattered most, about how to apply principles to new situations. But they did not argue about essence. They agreed on the core, that Jesus had been a teacher of profound insight, that his message concerned justice and compassion, and the proper relationship between humans and the divine, that his survival of arrest had been significant, without necessarily being miraculous. Jesus was remembered primarily as a teacher, a man spared once, not exalted forever, protected, perhaps, by divine favor or political accident or the incompetence of bureaucracy. Opinions varied, but not transformed into a cosmic event. His death, when it eventually came, would be quiet. No witnesses beyond those immediately present. No date that could be fixed with certainty. No location that could become a pilgrimage site. This mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Because without a public death, there was no demand for final explanation. No moment that required theology to harden quickly into definitive form. No empty tomb to organize belief around. No resurrection appearances to catalog and verify and defend against skepticism. So belief remained open. Open belief spreads slowly. It does not move with the force of certainty. It does not demand immediate commitment. It invites consideration rather than conversion. It accommodates doubt because it has not yet hardened into doctrine that treats doubt as betrayal. The communities that formed around Jesus' teachings grew gradually, organically, without centralized coordination. They resembled philosophical schools more than religious movements. Members gathered to discuss interpretations, to debate applications, to support each other in living according to principles that were easier to articulate than to practice. When Jesus eventually died, it was quiet. No crowd gathered. No authority was present to witness or record. No date was agreed upon later, because no one had reason to mark it as historically significant in the moment it occurred. His death interrupted nothing. It simply occurred, the way all deaths occur for people who are not emperors or generals or individuals whose passing alters power structures immediately. Memory lingered, then loosened. Those who had known him directly aged and died themselves. Their children and students carried forward what they had learned, but memory, filtered through 2 generations, becomes something different from direct experience. Details blurred. Chronologies became uncertain. Events that had seemed important at the time faded, while other moments, other teachings, gained prominence in retrospect. Stories smoothed themselves. Contradictions that had existed in oral tradition, different accounts of the same event, varying reports of what he had said or done, were resolved not by evidence, but by preference. Communities selected the versions that served them best, that fit most naturally with their existing practices and beliefs. Myth overtook memory gradually, invisibly. Not through deliberate invention, but through the natural process by which extraordinary individuals become legendary. Each retelling emphasized certain elements and minimized others. Each generation inherited a slightly more refined narrative than the one before. Meanwhile, Rome barely noticed. The empire had encountered countless teachers, prophets, philosophers, and reformers. Most faded. A few established schools that persisted for generations before disappearing. Occasionally, one proved troublesome enough to require suppression. Jesus' movement, such as it was, did not seem troublesome. In the western provinces, awareness arrived faintly, carried by travelers and merchants who mentioned in passing that certain communities in the East had adopted ethical teachings from a Jewish teacher who had survived an encounter with Roman justice. A story of a teacher who survived execution, or escaped it, or had it postponed indefinitely. The details varied depending on who told it. A moral tradition that emphasized endurance rather than sacrifice, compassion rather than punishment, the coming of a just kingdom rather than the mechanism of its arrival. Small communities gathered quietly in homes and rented spaces, discussing texts and interpretations, supporting members through hardship, offering mutual aid without requiring theological conformity. It was not threatening, which meant it was tolerated. Rome did not convert. It fragmented, not immediately, not catastrophically. The process took centuries and remained incomplete even at its furthest extent. But the mechanisms that had held empire together, shared civic religion, the emperor cult, the identification of political loyalty with religious participation, gradually weakened without being replaced by anything equally unifying. Belief did not replace civic religion. It joined a growing field of philosophies, cults, ethical schools, and local traditions. Mithraism remained popular among soldiers. Isis worship continued in port cities. Stoicism attracted educated administrators. Mystery religions offered initiates promises of transformation and belonging. And among these many options, the teachings attributed to Jesus formed one tradition among many, neither dominant nor suppressed, adapted differently in different regions according to local needs and existing practices. This absence of dominance mattered more than presence ever could, because when pressure mounted, economic strain from centuries of military expenditure, administrative overload as empire expanded beyond efficient governance, border instability as populations migrated under climate and political pressure, there was no shared metaphysical language left to compensate for failing material structures. In another world, a church would have filled that void. An institution claiming universal authority, capable of coordinating action across vast distances, providing ideological coherence when political coherence failed, offering spiritual rewards when material rewards became scarce. Here, nothing did. No single institution emerged with sufficient authority to claim empire-wide legitimacy. So Rome did not collapse dramatically. It thinned. Loyalty localized. Citizenship became transactional, valued when it provided tangible benefits, ignored when it demanded sacrifice without return. Authority attached itself to cities, councils, generals, families, whoever could provide security and order in immediate, verifiable ways. The empire remained visible on maps long after it ceased to matter morally. Borders existed. Distant cities still claimed connection to Rome. Latin remained an administrative language. Roads and aqueducts testified to a coherence that had once existed. But the lived experience of populations had already regionalized. Europe stabilized differently. Without a universal church claiming authority over temporal and spiritual matters, political structures developed more pragmatically, responding to local conditions rather than theological principles. Local governance strengthened earlier. Cities formed councils that managed resources, settled disputes, coordinated defense. These bodies gained legitimacy not through divine mandate, but through demonstrated competence. Citizens participated because participation produced results, not because participation fulfilled religious duty. Guilds and councils gained legitimacy without sacred endorsement. Craft organizations regulated trades, set standards, trained apprentices. Merchant associations managed markets, negotiated with distant partners, resolved conflicts. These institutions emerged from practical necessity and survived through practical effectiveness. Universities emerged not as religious institutions, but as practical ones. Knowledge needed shelter, places where texts could be preserved, where students could gather, where inquiry could proceed across generations. But that shelter did not require theological justification. The first universities formed around medicine, law, mathematics, languages. Scholars gathered because collaboration improved their work. Students came because education increased their prospects. Patrons funded these institutions because educated populations were more productive, more stable, more capable. Natural philosophy developed cautiously, then persistently. Not because belief disappeared. Religious conviction remained widespread, diverse, deeply felt by many individuals and communities, but because no institution could coordinate fear. In another timeline, churches possessed the organizational capacity to identify heresy, to define orthodoxy narrowly, to mobilize populations against perceived threats to cosmic order. Theological disputes could escalate into persecutions because institutions existed to fund, staff, and execute them. Here, belief remained too fragmented for that kind of coordination. Superstition existed. Fear existed. Periodic outbreaks of violence against marginal groups occurred in response to crop failures, plagues, economic disruption. But it remained local, brief, unsystematic. A village might turn against someone accused of malevolent magic. A city might expel a group during crisis. But these actions did not cascade into continent-wide campaigns, because no structure existed to amplify local fear into universal, imperative. Fear needs structure to scale. It never received it. When Islam later emerged in the 7th century, expanding rapidly through North Africa and into Iberia, it encountered a Jesus already remembered primarily as a teacher protected by God. There was no crucifixion to reinterpret, no resurrection to compete with, no foundational claim about Jesus' death being necessary for human salvation. Jesus fit naturally among prophets, a wise teacher, a man of moral insight, someone favored by God and preserved from his enemies. This created harmony rather than rivalry, not perfect harmony. Political conflicts still occurred. Territorial disputes, competition for resources, cultural frictions, all these remained. But theological conflict was muted. Trade routes carried not only goods, but commentary. Scholars translated texts without theological emergency. Greek philosophy moved into Arabic. Arabic mathematics moved into Latin. Medical knowledge circulated among practitioners regardless of religious affiliation. The Mediterranean became a zone of slow exchange rather than sharp opposition. Ideas moved across boundaries that remained permeable because they had never been fortified by absolute theological claims. By the early medieval period, Europe carried fewer inherited fractures. There was no Catholic-Orthodox divide, no moment in 1054 when competing claims to universal authority split the Christian world into mutually hostile factions. There had never been a unified Christian world to split. No moment where belief hardened into opposing absolutes, each claiming exclusive access to salvation, each anathematizing the other. Power remained political, not salvational. Kings ruled because they commanded armies, controlled resources, managed alliances. Their authority was contested by other nobles who possessed similar capabilities. Legitimacy came from effectiveness, inheritance, force, negotiation, the usual mechanisms of political power. Wars still occurred. They were still brutal. Armies still burned crops, besieged cities, slaughtered populations. Conquest still displaced peoples, destroyed cultures, transferred wealth violently from conquered to conqueror. But belief no longer supplied infinite justification. A king might claim God favored his cause. His opponents claimed the same. But neither could claim that enemy defeat was necessary for cosmic order, that enemy survival threatened salvation itself, that compromise with evil imperiled souls. Wars could end. Treaties could be negotiated. Former enemies could become allies without requiring theological gymnastics to justify the reversal. This mattered profoundly later. When monarchies strained under inequality during the 18th century, when populations chafed under taxation that enriched distant courts while local conditions deteriorated, resentment had fewer sacred targets. The French Revolution still occurred. population pressure, agricultural failure, fiscal crisis, Enlightenment ideals about natural rights and popular sovereignty, all the material and intellectual conditions that produced revolution remained present, but it arrived differently. There was no massive clerical class immune to taxation, no Catholic Church owning perhaps 10% of French land under divine mandate, no ecclesiastical courts operating outside royal jurisdiction, no regular clergy numbering in the tens of thousands while contributing minimally to state revenue. Anger focused on representation, administration, inequality, political problems requiring political solutions. The revolution burned slower. Its violence was real. Factions still emerged. Radicals still seized control. The terror still occurred, driven by paranoia and the logic of revolutionary purity. But its symbolism was muted. There were no grand campaigns against heaven, no festival of reason in Notre Dame, no systematic de-Christianization, because Christianity had never systematized itself sufficiently to require that kind of dismantling. Reason did not need to replace faith. It had already learned to coexist with it. Across Europe, states learned early that belief could not be centralized without enormous, ongoing effort that diverted resources from other purposes. So they stopped trying. Secular governance emerged not as rebellion against religious authority, but as habit formed over centuries, during which no religious authority had possessed the capacity to govern effectively. Colonial expansion still occurred. Ships still sailed from European ports seeking resources, markets, strategic advantages. Empires still extracted wealth from distant territories, still imposed governance on populations that had not requested it. But the language of salvation was weaker. Conquest justified itself economically rather than spiritually. Colonies were valuable for their resources, their labor, their strategic position. Missionaries existed, but remained marginal, lacking the institutional backing that would have made conversion a central imperial project. This did not make colonialism kinder. It made it quieter. Without the narrative that colonization saved souls, that indigenous religions imperiled salvation and required replacement, cultural destruction proceeded more slowly. Local practices persisted, not because colonizers respected them, but because colonizers lacked the ideological imperative to suppress them systematically. Modernity arrived familiar. Nations formed through the usual processes: warfare, treaty, marriage alliance, gradual consolidation of governance under centralized states. Industries expanded as technological innovation made production more efficient, as capital accumulated in ways that enabled investment in machinery, infrastructure, transportation. Science progressed steadily through the work of individuals and institutions that valued inquiry, that rewarded discovery, that built on previous findings through publication and replication. Religion persisted without domination. Communities continued to gather around shared beliefs. Individuals found meaning through practices their ancestors had transmitted. Seasonal rituals marked time. Life transitions received religious recognition. But belief was texture rather than structure. Fewer sects meant fewer absolute fault lines. Without a history of schism over theological precision, without centuries of wars fought over competing claims about salvation, religious differences rarely escalated into political crises. When I returned to the present, the world felt recognizable. Cities stood where I expected them. Their architecture evolved through centuries of development. Languages echoed familiarly. Latin had fragmented into Romance languages. Germanic tongues had developed similarly. Arabic had spread through trade and conquest. Technologies existed in roughly the forms I anticipated. Modernity had arrived through processes that seemed inevitable once certain discoveries occurred and certain economic conditions emerged. But something subtle was missing. There were fewer symbols of redemptive suffering. Crosses existed as historical markers, geometric designs, occasionally as reminders of Roman execution methods, but they did not dominate public space the way they might have. Less obsession with sacrifice as moral proof. Suffering was recognized as suffering, unfortunate, sometimes unavoidable, deserving of compassion and remedy. But it was not valorized as spiritually transformative in itself, not held up as the highest form of love, not treated as something to seek or celebrate. History here was debated constantly. Not because truth was unclear, but because authority had never monopolized it. No single institution had possessed the power to declare which accounts were orthodox and which were heretical, which histories were acceptable, and which required suppression. So multiple accounts survived, carrying different emphases, serving different communities, all existing simultaneously without one being able to eliminate the others. I did not save humanity. Suffering persisted. Injustice occurred. People harmed each other through cruelty, indifference, systemic oppression, war, poverty, exploitation, all the usual failures of human societies to achieve their own stated ideals remained present. I did not perfect belief. Religious conviction remained powerful for millions. Ethical questions remained difficult. Meaning continued to elude easy definition. People still struggled to live according to principles they recognized as valid but found difficult to practice. I removed one ending, one moment of apparent closure that had organized everything else into a narrative of sacrifice and redemption, of cosmic debt and payment, of humanity's need for salvation through divine suffering. And I allowed the rest of history to proceed without that certainty. Slowly, history without certainty moves more carefully. It debates rather than declares. It remains open to revision because it is not crystallized around moments of absolute meaning. This is not obviously better. Certainty provides comfort. Absolute claims about cosmic purpose help people endure suffering by placing it within narratives of ultimate justice. Salvation stories give shape to existence, offer hope when circumstances provide little reason for hope. But certainty also closes. It ends debate by declaring debate itself dangerous. It treats doubt as betrayal. It transforms differences of interpretation into cosmic conflicts requiring resolution through force. I chose to see what history looked like without one particular certainty. The answer is recognizable but different, quieter in some ways, more fragmented in others, less dramatic in its transformations, but perhaps more durable in its institutions. Whether this is better, I cannot say. I can only report what occurred when a single ending was removed and history proceeded without the story that ending would have told.